Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Very much looking forward to chatting with our next guest. I came across him because I was doing some research. I was very annoyed by a couple of phone-ins which were broadcast by BBC Radio 5 Live about discrimination against transgender men and women. I was annoyed by the lack of any balance in the phone-ins. There were men and women, transgender men and women, talking about being non-binary, not being referred to by the pronouns he and she, and that anybody referring to them in that way was bigoted, basically, and that this had to be stopped. And I looked into it a bit further, and I found that some academic institutions in this country want to remove the same pronouns and refer to people as Z, as Z-I-E, amongst other things. And to cap it all off, again, looking deep into this, we found that children, very young children, are being asked to look at a list of genders and to identify themselves with a gender on a list. And this is going on in a lot of places. Now, our next guest is a very distinguished psychiatrist. He's a Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. He stated that from a scientific perspective, being transgendered is a psychological issue and that cosmetic surgery isn't the proper treatment. But more importantly than that, and this is something I agree with, but I will put, of course, when your tweets and that come in, I will put the other point of view too as a doctor. But I do agree with him when he says that there's no scientific reason to grant any special rights or considerations to people who are unhappy with the sex they were born into, or to people who wish to dress in the clothes of the opposite sex, which I believe, he says, is not illegal, and I agree with that. He's kindly taken time out of his busy day today to chat with us. Let's welcome to the programme Dr. Joseph Berger. Dr. Berger, welcome to the programme. How are you?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, thanks for doing it. I really appreciate it. I'm very interested in the politicisation of this, and I want to talk about that. But first of all, I want to clear up, because when I announced you were coming on today, I was contacted by, not by any LGBT rights groups at all, but by one or two listeners to this programme, and they said, Richie, you better be fair and play the devil's advocate with the doctor and tell him that there are MRI studies and other studies to show that there is a physiological difference in the brain of transgenders, that their brain tends to change towards the makeup of the brain of the sex they want to be. What does the doctor say to that? So you can have the floor, Joseph. Tell us about your interest in this subject and why you are committed to the idea that it is an emotional issue and not a physical one.
Okay. Well, for a long time I've been involved with some of these issues. It started a number of years ago in terms of all the fuss that was being made about homosexuality and all the scientific debates that were going on in terms of the origins of homosexuality and all the literature. And when a lot of scientific studies were made in terms of the anatomy of the brain, the physiology, the chemistry of the brain, the genetics in terms of inheritance. Lots and lots of claims were made, which eventually nothing came out in terms of anything physical in terms of the brain or the body, for that matter, being proven as being a cause of homosexuality. So eventually, in the last few years, it has grown up, instead of homosexuality being a big controversial issue because it's now so much socially accepted and the science has sort of been pushed to the side. So now have come up all the issues around transgender. Now, whatever it is that people are calling to you about, I would be very, very careful indeed in terms of such claims that are being made, because the history in terms of science is, yes, a group, heaven knows where, in Japan, in Australia, around the corner in Newcastle, or heaven knows where, comes up with a study they have done, usually on a small group of people, and makes a claim. That is not the be-all and end-all. That is not the final answer. In terms of science, science is a continually challenging situation in which whatever you come up with today in terms of your research will then be challenged by the next group, and they will do a study with a larger number of people, and then another group will come on and do a study with a larger number of people, and eventually you'll get some sort of an idea in terms of whether the original claim was justified or not. As I say, in terms of the whole matter, in terms of the origins of homosexuality, in terms of anything physical in the brain or body, that eventually was researched and researched and researched, and the end result so far today is absolutely nothing in terms of a physical or body causation. I think in terms of transgender, it is so much too early that any studies that are being done now are being done on a very small number of people, and we'll have to wait and see if the claim from Group A is supported by the people from Group B doing a study on a larger number of people, and the people from Group C doing a study on a larger number of people. And I would be very hesitant indeed about accepting as definitive any early claim at this stage. It hasn't worked in terms of other things, and things that have seemed to be more definite in terms of mental disorders, when even they have been researched again and again by larger groups, have been found to be very questionable, that the original research claim just has not been confirmed by others doing similar sort of studies. So yes, people have picked up on all sorts of things, but it's far, far too early to make any definitive claim. And when you have that sort of situation, you have to get back to what is the most likely situation, which is we're talking about psychological issues, not about physical issues in the brain or the body.
Now, a transgender man or woman listening to this, again, to be fair and to be the devil's advocate, they might say, okay, we'll accept Dr. Berger's assertion that it's too early to take as fact the study done by the psychologist, the psychobiologist, I should say, Antonio Guillamon in Spain, who studied 24 people, which again backs up in some way, Joseph, what you just said, is that the studies are on too small a group yet to be definitive. But the transgender man or woman might say, well, you can't have it both ways. It might be very early to talk about a physiological cause, but it's equally too early to definitively say that it's an emotional issue. What do you say to that?
Well, what I say to that very straightforwardly is that people like myself who have looked at such people clinically, have met with them, interviewed them in our offices and so on for a number of years, I haven't seen anything to suggest in the slightest that these people have any sort of physical brain abnormalities, but all have had issues in terms of their feelings about themselves and about how they see themselves in terms of their sexuality and what went on in terms of their homes and their childhood and growing up years. They have issues. They have issues of a personal psychological nature, and those can be explored. There was a situation a number of years ago, actually, in Britain. There was a situation in Britain of a psychiatrist who, after one visit from somebody wanting to change their sex, was already starting them on hormone treatment. Well, this guy eventually lost his license to practice as a doctor because a number of these people some years later complained that they were not happy with the outcome, and he lost his license because he had been far too quick in terms of deciding on the basis of one visit, yes, this is indeed what you really want and what you should have, and let's start you on treatment straight away. So that was a very good illustration in terms of people not really understanding and assessing somebody sensibly and taking their time to do it. And those who take their time to do it, as I say, usually find that these people are people who are either unhappy or, in some cases, seriously disturbed. And as I said, the way to treat that is not with radical genital surgery.
Now, it's interesting that last year the famous actor Rupert Everett talked about this at great length in an article in The Guardian. He said that, he's glad that he didn't have the hormone treatment, and, he would have ended up, gender reassigning, and he said it was wrong, and he wrote about that. And we might come back to that. And I want to talk about what's behind this. But before we do, I do understand, Joseph, and I'm not trying to be the friend of every man or the friend of the listener. I'm not very politically correct. I say what I see and what I think. But I can understand why transgender men and women might be a bit disturbed, no pun intended, when they hear, not you, because you're a man of impeccable medical credentials, but when they hear, people from various Christian groups and other groups talking about mental illness, because from their point of view, that definitely leads to discrimination. And they say, well, look, I identify as a woman. I have done since I was very young. I'm having this gender reassignment. I'm not mentally ill. I live a pretty happy life. I've never been happier since I've decided to do that. And they get very worried when they hear mental illness. Do you understand that?
Absolutely, yes. And in fact, I have discouraged the idea in terms of some terms being used and being included as diagnostic categories, when really what we're dealing with is people's unhappiness. And if indeed people are saying, and you put on the label of mental illness onto me, I'm even more unhappy and angry, and to me that's perfectly understandable. The problem is that sometimes in order to get treatment, in order to be allowed to have hormone treatment, surgery, and so on, in some instances, it seems as if they need some sort of psychiatric diagnosis sometimes, which complicates things. Because otherwise, so to speak, to say to people who otherwise indeed are quite sane and normal, except for this degree of unhappiness, to just say to them, you're just unhappy. Try and resolve it with a good therapist. So some of them are going to say, no, thank you, no. Or I've been to therapists and nobody has helped me. I know what I want. I want to change my sex. So that becomes a bit of a problem. As far as I'm concerned, no, I am quite happy that it's not labeled a mental illness or anything like that. There are a few people, the way in which I express it is like this. Imagine that you put the person up against a wall, you hold a gun to their head and say, do you genuinely, seriously believe you're a man trapped in a woman's body, or you're a woman trapped in a man's body? Now, if they say yes, they're nuts. Then they are delusional, and they are, so to speak, in that way, mentally ill. If they say, no, of course not. I know that I'm not a man trapped in a woman's body. I'm not a woman trapped in a man's body. That's the way I feel. Then all it is unhappiness. They're unhappy. Now, they may indeed be profoundly unhappy with who they are, okay? But that does not necessarily mean to say that that's the best treatment, is to go and have various things of a very radical nature done to your body. And the results over the years, I think, are somewhat mixed. There are some people indeed who say they're happier, they're much happier, becoming the opposite sex, and there are others who have come along and said, no, I regret it, and I've not been that happy with it. It's very mixed. I just don't think that over the years there really have been enough to be able to draw very clear conclusions other than saying it's rather mixed, the results.
And that's very honest of you to say that. And again, I want to point out that we've been tweeted by people who say they believe that it is physiological, it is a biological issue. We've been tweeted by people who say that there's a hormone issue at gestation or during the pregnancy, and people believe this, and they will point to studies, and it's good we have that balance. We've got Dr. Joseph Berger on the line. One of the reasons I wanted to invite Joseph on the program more than anything is because, so when you see the call for legislation, when you see the call for, I'm non-binary and I don't want to be referred to as he or she, drop the pronouns. It is a bigoted thing if you don't drop the pronouns. When you see, all gender bathrooms, when you see this with the children, this is disturbing to me, Joseph. And again, I'm not easily disturbed. I don't like it. I don't like where it's going. What is behind this, in your opinion? What's the reason for this?
Well, you've asked so many questions.
Yeah, a lot of questions in there, yeah.
Let me try and deal with at least some of them, if I could have a little bit of clarity.
Plenty of time, go ahead.
On it. Okay, in terms of people wanting to be called something different, no, I am not in favor of going along with that sort of craziness. That starts to become crazy. No, excuse me, you want to dress like a woman, okay, you want to dress like a man, whatever, and so on, or you go ahead and have this sex changer operation, and then, then you're going to be called, as the case may be, a man or a woman. This sort of idea is very attention-seeking in a very immature way. Call me something different, that I'm not like anybody else. Well, that's like a little kid waving a flag and saying, look at me, look at me. It's an attention-seeking thing, and I'm not very sympathetic to that. When we start moving along in terms of school children, for example, we're getting into a very, very difficult area indeed. The one in between, in terms of the bathrooms, I've been in various places where there are whatever, 2 or 3 toilet stalls, essentially, and it's open to either men or women, and I don't see what the big deal is. There's a door, and the door is locked and so on, and whether it's a man or a woman that goes behind it shouldn't be an issue. I don't see any reason whatsoever to have a third category. That, to me, is totally unnecessary, and again, that's just attention-seeking. Now, in terms of moving on to school children, I'll give you an example of a very big and serious problem to me that came up recently in our capital city, Ottawa. And I was passed on by a journalist the advice being given, a curriculum advice being given to teachers in terms of dealing with transgendered children in the schools. This guideline was so totally biased, so totally one-sided, it was just incredible and very disturbing to see. It only considered the feelings of the so-called transgendered child. There was no consideration whatsoever for the other kids in the class or in the school. So you can imagine a situation, or I proposed hypothetical situations, where the class is going to gym, where the class is going swimming, whatever, and they're getting changed, and there's the boys' changing room, there's the girls' changing room. And in the boys' changing room is this little girl who thinks that she's a boy, or in the girls' room, the boy who thinks that he's a girl. And all the other girls are looking at little Johnny with his penis and saying, excuse me, you're a boy. And he says, no, I'm not, I'm a girl. Okay. Yeah. So the teacher is going to say, oh, no. Johnny thinks that he's a girl, so you've got to treat him as a girl. No, that's totally confusing to the other kids who, being young kids, let's say 7, 8-year-olds, see what they see with their eyes. And similarly, in terms of the boys' changing room, if a little girl comes in, excuse me, you're a little girl. I know, because my little sister has what you have, and so on, a vagina instead of a penis. And the little girl says, no, I'm a boy, and then goes home and crying to Mummy and says that, the boys didn't want me in their room, or the girls didn't want me in their room, and the parents complained to the teacher, who is then supposed to educate the kids somehow or other, the 7 and 8-year-olds, that what you're seeing with your eyes isn't really true.
Let me
Can you imagine anything more confusing?
I can't.
I'm a little kid. I know what I saw with my own eyes, and you're telling me, oh, but it isn't really true. It's such a load of nonsense, and unfortunately, this is what this school board, the Ottawa School Board, was being given as guidelines, and I think that it was a tragedy and a travesty, and very, very potentially harmful.
So what's behind this then? Because this is not
what's behind this
exactly, and I think
it's the latest. It's the latest fad. I think it's become a fad. The latest fad in terms of how do people deal with unhappiness. There have been these sort of almost traditional, you might say, depressions and anxiety and misery, whatever. But there are tons of those around. how do I get attention, so to speak? I mean, not necessarily that they're aware of it consciously, but how do I get attention in a different way that other people don't seem to be getting in the same way? I remember when my youngest daughter started off at university at a very, very good place in the United States, and she said to us, how come that all the other girls are on drugs? Because drugs were being pushed a great deal, even for young, late teenagers starting off university, for this little bit of anxiety here, there, and everywhere, instead of just taking in their strides. So, in a sense, as I say, this has become the latest way, I think, the latest fad in terms of getting attention and dealing with your unhappiness in a different way.
But let me ask you that another way. That's a good answer, and I'm very interested in it, and I'm certainly don't want to come across in any way like I'm patronising you. I certainly am not. But what I was getting at was, this seems to have blown up out of nowhere in the last 3 or 4 years. And what we're seeing is, around the world, this agenda. Now, could it be something more sinister than just a fad? When you have academia all over the world getting involved in this, I mean, I agree with everything you said earlier on. Men and women should be allowed to be who they want to be and choose to live the life they want to lead, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. And they should not be discriminated against in terms of, work or school or anything like that. They should be left alone and left to live their lives the way they want, and they should be treated like everybody else. But they are a very, very, very small minority. So what's going on? Could it be something even more sinister than a fad? Is there some sort of attack on gender going on here?
No, I don't think so. It has been around for a while. The earlier sex change operations were a number of years ago, and I remember when I first came to Canada, after having done my training in the United States, and a place that I was at briefly in order to be able to take the Canadian qualification to be a psychiatrist, had then, still, this is many years ago, had a whole unit in terms of assessing and recommending or not recommending for surgery people who wanted a sex change. Yeah. So we're talking many years ago that it was around, and then it was dropped, and it quietened down. All the fuss grew up about homosexuality, then about same-sex marriage. So there are these cycles, and now, having exhausted those in a sense, American Supreme Court has ruled. Canada took it for some years ago. The British Parliament has ruled on these things, and so on. So what do we do next, so to speak? What's going to be the next cause célèbre? So this, I think, has become at the moment, and a lot of people have jumped on the bandwagon. We had here in our province of Ontario, the largest province in terms of population in Canada, so because of the noise and the demands created. So the local Minister of Health decided that there would be more funding and more opportunities for people who wanted the surgery. There wasn't anything really medically to justify it. It was just an attempt to get popularity among the public, to say, look, we're responding to public pressure. As you're indicating, the real public pressure is very, very small indeed in terms of numbers, but it's something that the media have picked up on, and it seems to sell, so to speak, in terms of public interest, and you get certain characters like the ex-Bruce Jenner, the decathlon Olympic champion, saying, look, I've now decided to become a woman after having been married a few times and fathering a number of kids. Guess what? In my early 60s, I'm changing to become a woman. I think there was also an English football manager recently that I think decided he wanted to change his sex, also in his early 60s.
Let me just, again, this is brilliant stuff. Dr. Joseph Berger is on the line. I absolutely accept what you said about this being around a long time in the early sex change operations. The point I was trying to get across is the interest in it not just from the media, but from the state. That's relatively new in terms of talking about legislating for it, teaching it in schools, when it's such a non-issue anyway. Now, you mentioned Caitlyn Jenner and Bruce Jenner. We see in various soap opera programs, not that I'm a big fan of soap operas, Joseph, but we see transgender characters being introduced. What I'm trying to get to, and I'm not expecting you to have the answers to everything, but what is behind that agenda to foist it onto people that you must pay attention to this issue? It's almost like there's a promotion of this non-binary identity or this transgender agenda, a promotion coming from the media and the state. And if I'm right, and there is, why would there be? That's the $64 million question. What's going on?
Yeah, well, I think when you talk in terms of things like shows and so on, what you're talking there about essentially is attention seeking. How do I get attention in terms of my show and what I'm producing, that it should stand out from everybody else's? Now, for example, in the last few years, in terms of very large scale studies of thousands of people in different places, the prevalence, the numbers, so to speak, of people that are identify themselves as being homosexual is 1 to 3%, not higher than that. Maybe some will stretch it to 4%, but not higher than that. But have you ever seen in the last few years a movie, a TV show, whatever, where there is at least not one homosexual character? Has to be, so to speak, almost by law or something like that. You have to include at least one homosexual character, because that's something that has to be accepted by the public, and indeed it's become accepted by the public. Until a few years ago in the United States, regular frequent polls done for a number of years showed that 70% of the population were against same-sex marriage. Now, the Supreme Court decided same-sex marriage is okay, and you get more people in the population saying, oh, it's okay, this is what people want to do, no big deal. So I think in terms of putting on the public the acceptance of being different in this way, so you include such characters and you make them out to be the nicest, sweetest, most normal people that you'd want to be friendly with, that you'd want to have around your place at work, and why not? But one of the ways to do it is indeed to publicize it more and more, to make it seem as if every place of work, every university, every school, whatever, has such people. And I hear from my granddaughters. I asked her recently when I was talking with some of my couple of my granddaughters just starting a university in the States, and they said, sure, we have some people in terms of our classmates and so on that call themselves transgender. So it's become very much indeed a popular fad. Will those go through to having a full sex change surgery, hormones, etc.? I doubt that the majority will, only a minority. Again, now that's based to a certain extent on some research that was done a number of years ago on university students in terms of identifying themselves as homosexual. And in the early years of university, there was quite a high percentage. But by the time they'd finished university, were into younger adult life, etc., the percentage had come down very much to that sort of 1 to 3% that I quoted to you earlier.
Yeah, I want to make a point on that, by the way. You're right. I think what you said about society, we have gay men and women in our communities, in our families, amongst our circle of friends, and we don't care. We get on with people and we take people as their personality, how they behave. We don't need to be, bombarded and told to accept something by the state and by the media that we have accepted. Now, I want to ask you this. I'm running out of time, and then I'm going to honour my pledge. We're going to talk for a couple of minutes about football. And I guess, Dr. Berger, you must be pining for a good old chat about footy. So we'll do that in a minute. But before we do, here's a serious question for you now. What sort of impact is it having on the developmental brains and the minds of young children to be asked to confront these issues by their schools? It cannot be good for children, and I don't mean just transgender identity or asked to identify themselves with a gender. I mean getting them talking about anything to do with sexual reproduction and development at a very young age. What sort of impact? Because I can only imagine it must be a negative impact.
Yeah, well, you've asked an excellent question. I'll just, for as quickly as I can, get back to something that you just touched on earlier and that relates to development, and as that is the theories that some people came up with, that whether it applies to homosexuality or now to transgender, that there is some hormonal influence in the uterus on the developing child. And when I had the honor of debating in the House of Commons with some of the strongly homosexual people just before the vote that was going to be taken in the Commons about same-sex marriage acceptance or not. So one of the advocates for the other side was trying to push this, and I said, excuse me, you're not a doctor, you're not a scientist, you don't know what the science is on this. There is absolutely nothing to support it. This is just a speculative theory. Nobody has been able to do such research, and certainly not in terms of following it up 20, 25 years later to see how these people have turned out. So you can't make such a claim. That's purely speculation. So now in terms of your question, in terms of now, so on a very simple level, what most people who are parents know and interested in terms of bringing up children is that we try to do what is appropriate in terms of the child's age. There are things that are too early in terms of what we talk about with kids and what we do with kids, and some things that are too late. Nowadays, in terms of sex education for kids, the idea, of course, is that you don't wait until a child is 16 or 18 to talk about sex with them. Neither, though, do you start off when a child is 1.5 or 2 years old when they don't have a clue what you're talking about. So we rely, for the most part, in terms of the good sense of parents in terms of where their kids are at. When you start, indeed, your question in terms of especially bringing it into the schools and so on, you can indeed be very confusing in terms of bringing in things too early. We're seeing a lot of this in Canada, attempts by very biased people to push the schools into talking to kids about homosexuality, about same-sex couple parents and stuff like that, when the kids are far too young to really understand what's going on and to have some sort of perspective on it. So that's really the main concern, and that is introducing any sort of stuff like this too early in a way that just becomes confusing in the sort of manner that I was describing with the gym changing room and with the swimming pool changing room, in terms of really confusing kids in terms of things that they're not ready for, because little children, young children, are what we call very concrete. What they see in front of them is what it is. They don't have the ability yet to abstract. That's why little kids, 6, 7 years old, for instance, embarrass their parents in a shopping center by saying, "Look at that old man there. Look at that fat lady there." And the parents are absolutely horrified and want to fall through the floor because of their embarrassment, but because little kids are direct and open like that. So in terms of trying to put things in front of kids that just don't make any sense to them, that's a sort of big mistake, and that's obviously, that's, to use your word right from the beginning, that is politicizing. That's trying to push a political agenda on kids that aren't ready for it because of the people, the adults, own personal issues with it. Now,
I've got some very strong opinions about that I won't get into, but I'll invite you back on sometime when you have time, and we'll have a chat.
Pleasure.
Because I think that's deliberate, and I've got some very...
I think that you've asked some very good questions.
Well, thanks for saying that, Joseph. Dr. Joseph Berger is on the line. We've got about 3-4 minutes before we've got to get off air. So there you are. I mean, I'm obviously Irish, but you're one of our own. You're over there now in Canada. You've been in the States. And you're obviously a big football fan because you know I'm in Manchester. United played tonight. They lost to Hull City, but they still qualified for the final of the League Cup. You must be missing your football then, right? You're missing it.
Well, I miss it. I watch. We have a lot of games here, so I tape and watch the games. So a lot of the Premier League games I watch, and I'm still playing myself. I played yesterday afternoon with a group of people. Quite a few were ex-Brits. Then we have Greeks, we have Indians, we have from Eastern Europe, from Central Europe, people from all over the place, a Scottish friend of mine, and so on, and we're still playing.
Fantastic. And you've got to be a United fan then, right?
I have been a United fan since childhood, yes.
Fantastic.
And certainly the last few years it's been a very rocky ride indeed.
So
very, very briefly, if I could get a message across to Jose Mourinho, who referred to Marwan and Rashford. Yes, Marwan is your favourite, and drop him, get rid of him. Rashford is a superb youngster, one of the best youngsters around, has a tremendous football sense. Fellaini gets in the way. I've never seen Fellaini give one incisive pass that splits the defence in the way that Fabregas can do, in the way even that Rooney can still do, as he did last weekend, and so on. Fellaini just will pass it back to a person, and often it's the wrong person to pass it back to. And of course, Fellaini is the biggest fouler, and you don't need that. It costs penalties sometimes.
He's a big old lump.
It holds up the game. It drags you back from attacking because you got to stop because you committed another foul, and now they've got a chance to get themselves back in shape again and to move the ball. So get rid of him, but he's a favourite of Mourinho. And I don't like seeing a manager scowling up and down the touchline. I look at some of the guys like Diego of Atletico Madrid and some of the other guys who are just enthusiastic, and they're encouraging their players.
Play with a smile, playing with a smile on
I
their
just
face.
wish that were so. If I were playing with a guy like that who's scowling 3/4 of the time, I would feel very, very much dragged down. Come on, guy, cheer up. But I don't think that he's capable of doing it.
You'd probably
I would been a better choice.
Joseph,
Pep,
you'd probably.
On the other hand, Guardiola. He's a guy that I admire very much. I think he's done a marvelous job with every club before, and he's got some aging players, and that makes it difficult for him in terms of turning City around.
It's going to be a fascinating few weeks. It sounds like some of these scowling footballers, they could do worse than go and sit on your couch and have a conversation with you. You've got to put the 26th of February in your diary, because that's the League Cup final date. They'll play Southampton at 3 p.m. UK time. Joseph, we're just out of time. We've got to get out before we're kicked off the air. Thanks for that. That was fascinating. It was very objective. I'm glad you came on to talk about it.
Thank you very much indeed. It was a pleasure.
And I'd like to have you back on again in the future on these issues. Thanks, Joseph.
You're welcome. Bye.
And look after yourself. Dr. Joseph Berger on the line to us there from Toronto in Canada. Fascinating man. And I did mention, and those members of our audience and people that we know who feel very strongly about being described as being mentally ill, you heard him say there, it's unacceptable that. And those who feel very strongly that there is physiological, biological evidence that there is a change in the makeup of the brain, and that there is evidence that transgenders, their brain begins to or does resemble that of the brain of the sex they identify with. I did put those points to him. He said the jury's out on that, which I think was objective. I agree with that, even though I'm not a scientist. I reiterate again, how dare anybody belittle, insult, demean, commit a wrong against or discriminate against anybody because of their sexual orientation, the way they look, the colour of their skin or their religious belief. It's a disgrace. It's idiocy. It's wrong. And nobody would condone that. We're interested in, and this programme is, why are they pushing it? Why, when transgender men and women would be, a significant minority in the community, if that's an oxymoron, or it isn't, I don't know what is a significant minority, but they are a minority. So why all of this talk about, no sex bathrooms and non-binary and teaching children this? What's going on with it? We've got strong opinions on it. I suggest you read The Perception Deception, or you read Phantom Self as a start into what's really going on with this.